Hello, everyone. I'm glad you were able to join us today. Crisis leadership is very much something that's very relevant in our world today with just multiple crises going on. And we thought it would be good to run the session, especially on the heels of a couple of major hurricanes that happened in the United States, one close to where some of us are, Joel and John, through some family connections, and myself here in North Carolina. So, what we thought we'd do today was share some learning about the nature of crisis leadership from examining a couple of recent crises or major crises, and then share some stories about what we observed going down during these crises. And with Leadership Forum, it's also about conversations we have together. It's a community, as John said. So we'll do a breakout where we can get to share our own stories and learning. And then we come back and distill some collective learning that we've acquired through the session. So that's the game plan for today. And I think we'll move on to the next slide. So this is a framework that emerged from a fairly extensive conversation that we had after Hurricane Katrina. So Hurricane Katrina was a major hurricane that hit the New Orleans, Mississippi Delta area, and it was widely considered a failure of leadership. There were a lot of people who lost their lives. The city of New Orleans was flooded, and a lot of formal leadership was really paralyzed. And what emerged from the conversations that we had was this reflection. It was put together by some 20 so people who arrived, and they were people from the Coast Guard, the US military, from major nonprofits, such as the American Red Cross, a lot of grassroots organizers and such. So we tried to bring in a holistic perspective. And what really emerged was also a holistic perspective. I see we've got Cliff on the call today, who's an expert in polarity thinking, and this is a model that looks like a polarity model. But it's saying that actually it's not just one thing that is able to help us in times of crises. It's actually almost these opposing forces that we need to bring together, not just individuals who step up, but also moving collective action. It's not just the need for crisis leadership plans or crisis plans, but also the need to improvise in the moment. So a lot of this really calls out on the complexity of crises, and that's some of what we'd like to get into today. So move to the next slide. So here's also another framework that has been used to describe the nature of crises. And you might have seen variations of this kind of somewhat U-shaped model that is part of change processes. So when we have a disaster happen, typically there is a heroic response because a lot of people show up and try to help. And it creates a sense of kinship and community. People feel good about participation and what they're doing. But then you move into a zone of disillusionment. And what happens is that, of course, the people that aren't directly affected by the crisis move on to other things. The attention and the aid starts to dry up. And it's a long period, really, coming out of a crisis back to a new normal, to that reconstruction. So, in terms of crisis leadership, it's important to also think about the duration of this. This was also an element on the previous slide, but recognizing that there are multiple stages that we go through. But today we're really going to be talking about very much the first stage in this journey, which is where we are, I think, especially with this new Helene crisis. So on to the next slide. So here's some learning that emerged, especially from Katrina, but as we followed crises for many years, earthquakes, plane crashes, um, things like the plane going down into the Hudson, we saw that the patterns that actually emerged from all those crises were all related. And this is some of what we saw. So inherently, systems fail. And almost by definition, a crisis happens because what happens is not what we expected to happen. So therefore, we are unprepared. If it was something that we'd be prepared for, it probably isn't a crisis. Also related to that, plans are insufficient. So oftentimes in organizations, there's some element of crisis leadership planning that's present, but oftentimes these envision a certain kind of scenario. And when something different happens, actually plans become a problem. They're a barrier because they catch us off guard. And the nature of crises actually is that the picture, the information that we have is distorted. There's a lot of localized needs that are going on. And it's really hard to understand where things are happening, what's actually going on in the moment. And even as we observe this crisis with Helene right now, there's just a lot of, even though we have social media, it's actually to some degree added to the amount of information we have, but also the distortion. There's a lot of false information there about what's going on. There's a need to respond to the crisis immediately. In these disasters, of course, the people whose lives are at risk. In Helene, the people who had to, as in Katrina, had to break out of their homes through the roofs of their houses because the floodwaters were rising so high. So there's just a lot of urgency to respond because people are caught in the midst of it. And by virtue of the nature of the response, we find that authority is limited because they aren't able to deal with the scope of what's going on, any kind of functioning authority, and that it's also actually limiting because if we rely on formal systems to respond, they're going to come up short. And one of the things about crisis is that we often think that we need a centralized command structure that is going to collect all the information and make decisions. But because the nature of crisis being so fluid and broad, that actually when we rely on formal centralized systems, we run into all kinds of problems. So what actually happens is that we start to see a lot of new leadership emerge because there is a need that isn't being met, and a lot of informal actors, individuals, grassroots organizations, collectives of people actually rise up to respond, and that's critical. So on to the next slide here. All right. So I wanted to share, and we'll go to the tsunami and we'll go to Helene after that, but just share some stories to paint, fill in the picture of these patterns. So I'd love to talk about three quick examples of response during Katrina. And this is a group of people, a somewhat fuzzy picture, but it comes from a report called Stepping into the Void. But these were the people that we brought together to have the conversation that developed the framework I'd shared a little bit earlier. So Angela Cole is an individual, and she is a nurse from upstate New York. And she was watching the Hurricane Katrina crisis unfold on the TV news. And she felt called to act. And she said the only qualification she had, of course, she was a nurse, but she was from the South, from Georgia, not exactly the zone that was affected. And she felt, well, she said, well, I feel called to help and I speak quote unquote Southern. She felt a sense of kinship. So she loaded up her pickup truck with a bunch of supplies and she drove down and she found a small community that had been unaddressed, under resourced, and was left out there. And she had hoped to maybe stay for a week, providing relief. She wound up staying for many months and became a very critical figure in mobilizing a lot of relief efforts, wound up getting on the national news and bringing a lot of national level support to the small community. So, in these crisis situations, the role of individuals who feel compelled to act become very significant. Here in my town, which is Greensboro, we're about an hour or so from the areas affected. But there's a young man by the name of Trent. He's not quite 30, and he's mobilized citywide efforts to collect food. I think he's moved up hundreds of thousands of dollars in food and aid up to affected regions. And it just demonstrates that individuals who feel compelled to act can make quite a difference. In terms of organizations, many organizations actually came up short during Hurricane Katrina because of the scope and scale of the challenge. But one entity that did well was the Coast Guard. And it's really interesting as to what made that possible. Now, the Coast Guard is an organization that is built for rescuing people. However, the Hurricane Katrina situation was nothing like what they had experienced before because they're trained to do a lot of open water rescues. Here they had to fly into the city, between power lines, get people out through the roofs of their houses. There are as many as 500 aircraft in the air. There's no aircraft control. So just the immense scope of what they had to do and the difference from what they'd been trained was enormous. One of the persons who had joined us here, who was the Coast Guard commander, said actually people ran more rescues in those few days than they would in an entire career. So one can just imagine the amount of pressure that was on them. But what enabled the Coast Guard to actually function really well is that they had a culture that actually enabled people who were on the front lines to make decisions. Now, this is very different from a lot of organizations where people on the front lines might be sensing things, but they push information back the chain of command up to centralized people who then process the information and provide permissions for certain things to happen. All of that takes a long time, further distortion of information, a level of paralysis. And that's why a lot of entities like the army, the police, etc., felt somewhat paralyzed during Katrina. But the Coast Guard was able to respond because they had this concept of on the scene initiative. And they said, well, people who are there make the decisions that you think are needed, and we're going to back you up. And how they felt that they could actually trust people to make good decisions is that they'd done a lot of training beforehand. So when there isn't a crisis, of course, they're doing a lot of drills. And that allows people to have a sense of here's how you might think about things, here's how you might operate, which then actually allowed them to improvise and do a lot of things that were different from what they'd been trained to do. There's also a systemic level response. So people from the hurricane zone, New Orleans, etc., had to evacuate north, and they wound up in small towns. One of them was called Ville Platte, which is a small, rural, semi-rural Cajun kind of community, very poor, I think one of the poorest in the United States. And they had more people wind up there than the entire population of the town. But they made sure that everybody got taken care of, got fed, had a place to stay, had clean clothes, etc. And how did that happen? It's because it was a community that was built on hardship, and people there had a culture of really helping each other. So it so happened like a local community person got on the local radio and said, hey, we've got all these people coming in. We need to be able to help. So here's the central zone. We need X, Y, and Z. And if you got this, show up. And so the whole community really rallied together to take care of people who emerged. And it's really a very heroic story, but it's also a very powerful story of the nature of community. And in all of these things, I think what you'll hear is the importance of networks and relationships. Because if these exist, then we can mobilize in order to respond effectively to crises. So on to the next slide, and I think Joel will talk a little bit about his learning from being in the midst of the tsunami.
Yeah, thanks, Lyndon. It's always good to hear connections and stories related to what people have experienced, and probably everyone on the call hopefully is starting to think about how they've experienced crises because they can look in many different ways. The first bullet that I want to talk about here is yes, the tsunami in Sri Lanka. So, for those who remember it, it was 2004, 2005, a tsunami before the tsunami radar systems were established, came out of nowhere, and tens of thousands of people in Sri Lanka, died. Becca and I, my wife, we had moved there to work for the YMCA. We were working as world service workers, and it was our first year of marriage together. So kind of I don't know, maybe joke is that people say, "Oh, you went to Sri Lanka to have a honeymoon," and we were there to work as volunteers, and then a tsunami came through. So it was far from very much a traditional honeymoon. Um, it was a fantastic year, but halfway through it, the tsunami came through. And my role when I was there was to develop a leadership training program for an island-wide YMCA group of secretaries. And those were really young professionals. And so was training them up on leadership practices. And what ended up happening now years later, or even during the tsunami, is that many of them were tapped into leadership roles. And when I went back years later to actually connect with some of them and say, hey, what enabled you to step up during the response? And they actually pointed to their leadership training. Now, I was the interviewer, so there might have been some bias there that they were flattering me a little bit that the leadership training actually helped prepare them. But it was an example of how people being trained a little bit on leadership practices enabled them to respond during the tsunami. So I've gone out of bullet orders here. I know somebody's going to get muted here in a second. So I wanted to give you a little bit background on Sri Lanka and the tsunami, and return to this first bullet here, which is around picture is distorted, and that's from, the list of um, aspects that Lyndon talked about how things kind of disappear a little bit. And so um, the picture is distorted actually connects with me because when I read this statement, it says, as a crisis explodes, no one has a complete picture of what is happening. All involved have a fragmented understanding of what may actually be going on. And what I want to highlight in this is that statement of, all just the picture being distorted is true 20 years later when I look back and process my experience. Yes, sometimes through PTSD and such, but I still learn from the experience of having lived through that. And it was incredibly challenging when I was there to hear people, because this was December 26th when it happened. And so for a couple of weeks, nothing existed outside of the world of the disaster. And yet I was getting emails from people back in the US who were preparing for New Year's parties and other things. And I'm like, how can people possibly be doing that? And some of the learning that comes with this is me now having witnessed Katrina in Western New York, Western North Carolina, and other things. And you realize that the picture is distorted not only for the people on the ground, but also for the people that don't know how to respond but want to help. Because when I see these things happening, I'm like, I so want to help, but I have no idea what I should be doing or how I can. And often we can't just pick up and go be there. So I continue to process, what it's like for everyone in the system when a crisis is happening. And I think that's important for leaders to understand too. So just two other quick ones that connect back to new leadership emerges is everyone has the power to do something. And the story I tell about that is when we were in Sri Lanka, there was an older YMCA gentleman, and he was probably 75 or 80 years old. And that's not super old because I know many of us have friends and relatives that are that age. But this person really was a bit fragile when you looked at them. And this person raised their hand saying, I want to volunteer and I want to go out to images that look like this on the screen and I want to be able to help. And I'm like, I so believe in that philosophy that everyone has the ability to do something. And yet, Becca and I needed to really process and talk. We're like, should we let Roland go or not? And we're just like, we want to empower him. We want to stay true to our beliefs, but he might be more of a liability out there. And we ended up encouraging him to go. And that entire weekend, he went out with a bunch of young people from the YMCA. We were just like, how is it going? What's going on? What's the impact of this? And what happened is when everyone came back, one of the young people said, Roland was probably the most important person there. And we're like, well, what did he do? He's like, he brought humor and he helped us all relax out there. So this person who was frail didn't have the ability to lift or do anything, but he did end up have the ability to help people just have some humanity about them when they were out there. So that connects to new leadership because, as I said, when I went back to talk to those young people, they really stepped up to respond to leadership, and those young people have since gone on. I've shared way too much. Want to go on to the next slide. John, help us understand some of the context in Western North Carolina.
Yeah, hello everybody. Glad to be here. First of all, Western North Carolina, I've learned to love this part of the country through my daughter and son. And my daughter decided to go to college down in Swananoa, which is right in that area, back in, 12 years ago. And she fell in love and she's still there, living in Asheville with her guy. And then my son, about 4 years ago, loved it so much that he moved down. And about a year ago, he took over a business in downtown Marshall called the Marshall Main Street Cafe. And I think both Julia and John have been exposed to personal leadership, and they take pride in what they do. Julia is a big volunteer person. John, wanted to make sure he could employ people and pay them a wage that they could live on in that area. So, they both, I think, understand leadership very much in a conversational way. But for a little bit of context, Helene hit the land really on September 27th. And for Western North Carolina, it created unprecedented flooding and damage. And you need to understand that Asheville and Marshall are both 300 miles inland from water, yet the flood of water damaged both cities in different ways. And the flooding in Asheville was substantial. It knocked out the city's water system and electrical grid and damaged homes and businesses. The main highway, Interstate I-40, which connects Asheville to eastern Tennessee, probably won't open for 1 or 2 years. It was one of the most beautiful rides you could take through the mountains, through the Blue Ridge Mountains, and that'll be shut for 1 to 2 years. As of today, much of the electrical grid is up and running, but food and water shortages continue. Aid is poured into Asheville from FEMA, nonprofits, and everyday people. I mean, once you're connected on social media, you see all the activities and people volunteering to get in there, people offering donkeys to go into the mountains and find people. There's still, I think, 96 people listed as missing as of this past week. And thousands of residents have been volunteering daily to bring the city back. And the response has been nothing less than inspiring. Actually, my daughter and her guy were just up here with us for a couple of days, so we got to understand it, firsthand. And Tyler works for the city of Asheville, so he's been like on emergency services since it happened. Marshall, North Carolina is a historic town of only 800 people. It's located about 20 miles northwest of Asheville in the mountains and adjacent to the French Broad River. And it has a long history. It's known for mountain culture, Appalachian music, and the arts. It's also a favorite destination for hikers and kayakers. And so it's never overly crowded, maybe 5-6 weekends a year, but it's just a favorite spot. And I think in that picture that you have up there, that's downtown Marshall, and it was absolutely devastated with every business and residents in the town itself overwhelmed by water and 3 to 4 feet of river muck. I mean, none of the businesses will be operating for months. And the question for Marshall, I think, is can the business district recover? As most businesses did not have flood insurance. Most residents live week to week. And it'll take time for tourists to return. And one of the problems I found about this week is in both Asheville and especially in Marshall, because some people do live off the grid, many in Marshall don't trust the government. So applying for aid through FEMA is absolutely out of the question. And FEMA, I think, has been very good in communicating and said, listen, if you're an illegal immigrant, we're not going to report you. We're still here to help, but they still won't fill out an application. And, the impact is that, plus as of last week, 226 people had lost their lives, and 96 people are still listed as missing, and may never be found based on the landscape there. We've learned, I think, and as Joel and Lyndon pointed out, that at times like this, leaders surface, and in my opinion, the examples I'm going to give you is that people activate their values, even if they don't go through an exercise to know exactly what their values are. They leverage their experience and they use purpose and proactivity as their guide, and they go into action, and it's all towards helping others. And I'm going to refer to this as leading from the inside out. So 2 examples I'll share with you that I think are extraordinary in different ways. One guy is Adam Jones, and Adams is a chef that lives in Raleigh, North Carolina, 250 miles east of Asheville. He focuses in his work on pay what you can food services, a food truck and restaurant. He's got 2 children, and his wife is a district leader in Raleigh, so he has a full life. But historically, Adam is known for rising to difficult occasions. When his disabled sister was unable to care for her 3 teenage, I think they were twins, 15 and a 13-year-old, Adam stepped in and guided their day-to-day lives, education, taught them life skills, and provided moral support. And today they're functioning adults and responsible adults. 2 years ago, when his half brother needed a kidney to survive, Adam was a match, and this guy was all in. He put everything aside to make sure they could get this kidney donation in time. And so within 3 days of Helene, it hit on a Friday, and that Monday, Adam rallied his network of chefs and food service professionals using the handle #ChefsForCarolina. And since then, they've been preparing and shipping about 2,500 meals per day to Asheville. And the thing about that Western Carolina, there's so many small towns. Some have been wiped off the map. And they've been really focused on that. And so they're serving as an adjunct to the World Central Kitchen, which has been providing, I think they say, a total of 25,000 meals each day in Western North Carolina. And he plans to continue to provide his support as long as it's needed. And just one, World Central Kitchen, my daughter said she's been volunteering for them, as she said, is the real deal. She said they go out into the mountains to find people with food. They don't just create a center. The other example is in Marshall, and it's a guy by the name of Eric George. And interestingly, and I think rightfully, he's a Marvel superhero enthusiast. He lives a simple life in a trailer on higher ground where my son lives in Marshall. He's a dishwasher, cook, do anything resource. So whenever I was down there or in the business or even talking to people, Eric's name would come up. So he was an amazing resource for my son's business. And he earns enough to cover his expenses, again, week to week, and to get more tattoos. He's heavily tattooed. That's his hobby. And he'll tell you, I mean, you don't have to ask him. He'll just tell you what a great life he has. And so when the hurricane hit, I mean, he was there Saturday, Sunday down in the town, digging out muck day after day, doing interviews on TV. And he's not an interview type guy, but there was a local reporter, a young lady in town, and he sort of saw her and she had no idea where to go. And he said, come, follow me. I'll show you around. And he took her around. They interviewed him on this piece, and he was amazing. He uses Facebook to get the word out. And he's currently testing water lines at individual properties to determine the extent of the they can get water doing. And I realized that, being a dishwasher, I did do that once in my life, does provide an education in water management. And so he's put it to use. And so I said, we talk about purpose, he was interviewed on the station and he said, I love Marshall, and he knows how important the recovery is to the community. As I said, there's a question of whether that community will come back. And I think they've both demonstrated, the world's full of people committed to, I think creating meaningful change and being proactive, positive, and purposeful. The thing that, if you go to that hashtag I gave you, the thing that Adam did very well is we talk about leadership a lot, but leadership is not managing. And if you go to that hashtag, you'd be amazed in the detail he's gotten involved in pulling this off. And I subscribe to the thought that culture is about people, purpose, and process. And so I'd say Eric is more people, purpose, let's go do it. Where in Adam's case, and I think because he's a chef, he understands organization, he has pulled things together and within 2 days was delivering these meals to Western North Carolina. So very different examples, but I think it gives you an idea of how leadership comes from everywhere.